The morning mist clung to the mountain peaks like ghostly fingers, and Master Chen Wei felt the disturbance before he saw it. After 40 years of practicing the ancient arts passed down through generations of his family, his body had become a finely tuned instrument, capable of sensing the slightest shift in the natural order. Today, something was terribly wrong. Chen Wei stood on the wooden platform outside his monastery, a structure that had weathered countless storms for over 3 centuries. His weathered hands gripped the prayer beads carved from bamboo, each one representing a lesson learned through decades of disciplined training. The 60-year-old master had devoted his entire life to preserving the traditional fighting techniques of his ancestors, techniques that most of the modern world had dismissed as outdated folklore. The earth trembled beneath his feet, not with the familiar rhythm of a natural earthquake, but with something deliberate and purposeful. Birds fled from the trees in panicked waves, their cries echoing across the valley like warnings. The master's keen eyes scanned the horizon, searching for the source of the disturbance that made his very soul ache with dread. In the distance, near the base of Mount Kunlun, a crack appeared in the mountainside. It started as a thin line, barely visible against the rocky surface, but within moments it widened into a gaping wound in the earth itself. Ancient air escaped from the opening, carrying with it the stench of something that had been buried for millennia. Chen Wei's nostrils flared as he recognized the smell: death, decay, and something far more sinister. The crack continued to grow, splitting the mountain like a ripe fruit. Chunks of rock tumbled down the slopes, creating avalanches that destroyed everything in their path. But what emerged from the depths made the falling stones seem insignificant. Shadows poured out of the opening, not the natural darkness of caves, but something alive and hungry. Chen Wei had heard the stories from his grandfather, tales dismissed by most as superstitious nonsense. According to ancient texts hidden deep within the monastery's archives, creatures of immense power had once ruled the earth. These beings, older than human civilization, had been imprisoned beneath the mountains by warriors who possessed knowledge and abilities that modern humans had forgotten. The seals that held them had been weakened over countless centuries, and now they were finally breaking free. The first creature to emerge defied easy description. Its body stretched nearly 30 feet in length, covered in scales that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. 6 legs, each ending in claws capable of rending stone, carried its serpentine form across the mountainside with impossible speed. What disturbed Chen Wei most were its eyes, intelligent, calculating, and filled with an ancient hatred that made his blood run cold. The beast raised its head and released a sound that was part roar, part shriek, and part something that human ears were never meant to hear. The sound waves rippled through the air with physical force, shattering windows in the valley below and causing birds to fall dead from the sky. Chen Wei pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate his very bones. More creatures began emerging from the widening crack. Some flew on wings that blotted out the sun, others crawled on legs that numbered in the dozens. Each one was unique in its horror, yet all shared the same ancient malevolence. They had been waiting, planning, dreaming of revenge against the descendants of those who had imprisoned them. The modern world was completely unprepared for what was about to unfold. In the nearby city of Xining, people went about their daily routines, unaware that their reality was about to be shattered. Office workers checked their phones, students attended classes, and families gathered for lunch, all blissfully ignorant of the nightmare emerging from the mountains. Chen Wei knew he had to act. The ancient texts spoke of warriors who had faced these creatures before, men and women who had dedicated their lives to mastering techniques specifically designed to combat supernatural threats. The knowledge had been passed down through select lineages, preserved against the day when it might be needed again. That day had finally arrived. He rushed into the monastery, his feet moving with practiced silence across the wooden floors. The building contained rooms filled with scrolls, weapons, and artifacts that most visitors assumed were merely decorative. In truth, they were a carefully maintained arsenal, kept ready for a war that most people believed would never come. The master's private chamber housed his most precious possessions. Ancient swords hung on the walls, their blades inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and move when viewed directly. Armor crafted from materials that no longer existed sat on stands, each piece blessed with protective enchantments. Most importantly, a series of leather-bound journals contained the accumulated knowledge of generations of warriors who had faced the impossible and survived. Chen Wei selected a sword that had been in his family for 8 centuries. The weapon hummed with latent energy as his fingers closed around the grip. The blade was forged from metal that had been treated with substances extracted from creatures similar to those now emerging from the mountain. It was one of the few weapons capable of actually harming beings that existed partially outside normal reality. As he strapped on armor that felt as light as silk despite being stronger than any modern material, Chen Wei felt the weight of his responsibility. He was likely the only person within hundreds of miles who possessed the knowledge and training necessary to face what was coming. The modern military would be useless against creatures that could phase through solid matter or regenerate from wounds that should have been fatal. The ground shook again, more violently this time. Through his window, Chen Wei could see that dozens of creatures had now emerged from the crack in the mountain. They spread across the landscape like a plague, each one heading in a different direction. Some moved toward populated areas, drawn by the life force of unsuspecting humans. Others seemed to be searching for something specific, following paths that led to locations of ancient significance. Chen Wei grabbed a communication device, one of the few modern conveniences he allowed in his traditional sanctuary. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed the number for the local emergency services. When the operator answered, he tried to explain the situation in terms that wouldn't immediately result in his call being dismissed as the ravings of a madman. This is Chen Wei at the Kunlun Monastery. There has been a major geological event near Mount Kunlun. Dangerous animals have been released from underground caverns. Immediate evacuation of the surrounding area is required. The operator's voice crackled through the device. Sir, we haven't received any reports of seismic activity in your area. Are you certain about what you've observed? Chen Wei watched as a winged creature the size of a commercial aircraft soared over the valley, its shadow causing plants to wither and die wherever it passed. I am absolutely certain. Lives are in immediate danger. He ended the call knowing that official help would come too late, if it came at all. The authorities would need to see the creatures with their own eyes before they accepted the reality of the threat. By then, countless innocent people would already be dead. A new sound drew his attention, the approach of vehicles on the mountain road. Chen Wei looked out to see a convoy of black cars racing up the winding path toward his monastery. The vehicles moved with military precision, and he could see armed figures through the tinted windows. Either someone in the government already knew about the ancient threat, or his phone call had triggered a response from agencies that operated beyond public awareness. The lead vehicle skidded to a halt in the courtyard outside the monastery. Doors opened simultaneously, and 6 individuals emerged. They wore dark tactical gear and carried weapons that Chen Wei recognized as being far more advanced than anything available to regular military forces. The leader, a woman with short gray hair and calculating eyes, approached the monastery entrance. "Master Chen!" she called out, her voice carrying easily across the distance. "My name is Director Sarah Collins. We need to talk." Chen Wei descended from his chamber, moving with the fluid grace that came from decades of martial arts training. As he approached the visitors, he could sense something unusual about them. They carried themselves like warriors, but there was an underlying tension that suggested they knew more about the current situation than ordinary soldiers would. Director Collins stepped forward, her hand resting casually on what appeared to be a modified energy weapon. We represent an international organization dedicated to dealing with threats that fall outside normal parameters. We've been monitoring seismic activity and electromagnetic anomalies in this region for the past 72 hours. Then you know what has been released, Chen Wei said, studying the faces of the armed team. Each one showed the kind of focused alertness that came from facing genuine danger. We know that something has emerged from underground chambers that we've been tracking for decades. What we need from you is information about how to fight them. Collins gestured toward the mountain, where more creatures continued to pour from the expanding crack. Our conventional weapons are proving ineffective. Chen Wei nodded grimly. The creatures are not entirely physical. They exist partially in dimensions that normal weapons cannot reach. Your bullets and explosives will cause minimal damage unless they are specifically prepared with materials and techniques that your modern science has forgotten. But you know these techniques, Collins said. It wasn't a question. I am the keeper of knowledge that has been preserved for this day. My ancestors fought these creatures before, and they developed methods for destroying them. However, the task ahead is more difficult than anything they ever faced. One of Collins' team members, a tall man with intricate tattoos covering his arms, stepped forward. How many of these things are we dealing with? Chen Wei closed his eyes for a moment, extending his senses toward the mountain. What he felt made his heart sink. The chamber that has opened is vast. Hundreds of creatures were imprisoned within it, possibly thousands. Some are foot soldiers, relatively weak but numerous. Others are generals, beings of immense power that commanded armies in the ancient wars. And you believe you can teach us to fight them? Collins asked. I can try. But understand that the knowledge required cannot be learned in days or weeks. My training began when I was 5 years old and has continued for over half a century. What you need are weapons and techniques that can be utilized by soldiers with conventional training. The ground trembled again, and this time the shaking was accompanied by an unearthly howl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. In the distance, a pillar of black flame erupted from the crack in the mountain, reaching high into the sky before spreading outward like an umbrella of darkness. We don't have time for extended training, Collins said grimly. Our intelligence suggests that similar breaches are occurring at sites around the world. Whatever imprisoned these creatures is failing globally. Chen Wei felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. If multiple sites were being compromised, then humanity faced an extinction-level threat. The ancient creatures had ruled the earth for millions of years before being defeated and imprisoned. They would not be content to simply reclaim their former territory. They would seek to eliminate every trace of the species that had dared to challenge them. Then we must work with what time we have, the master said. Follow me. There are things you need to see, weapons you need to understand, and techniques that might give your soldiers a chance of survival. As they entered the monastery, Chen Wei caught sight of a massive shape moving through the clouds above the mountain. It was easily the size of a city block, its form suggesting a cross between a jellyfish and a dragon. Tentacles that stretched for miles hung beneath its bulk, and where they touched the ground, the very earth began to transform into something alien and hostile. The war for humanity's survival had begun, and Master Chen Wei was possibly the only person alive who understood the true scope of what they were facing. The creatures emerging from the mountain were just the beginning. If the ancient texts were correct, far worse things lay dormant beneath other sites around the world. Time was running out, and the fate of the human race now rested on the shoulders of an aging kung fu master and a team of soldiers whose conventional training would be useless against enemies that could reshape reality itself. The ancient creatures had waited millennia for their revenge, and they were finally free to claim it. The monastery's hidden chambers revealed secrets that made Director Collins and her team exchange worried glances. Chen Wei led them through passages carved directly into the mountain rock, past walls covered with symbols that seemed to pulse with their own light. Ancient weapons lined the corridors, each one designed for a specific type of supernatural threat. "Your organization has been tracking these sites for decades," Chen Wei said as they descended deeper into the complex. "But my family has been guarding this knowledge for centuries. We knew this day would come." Collins examined a spear whose point seemed to bend light around itself. "How many sites are there globally?" 13 primary locations, with dozens of smaller ones. The creatures were not all imprisoned in the same place. Different types required different containment methods. Chen Wei paused at a massive bronze door covered in intricate carvings. "This chamber contains weapons and armor that can harm beings from other dimensions. But first, you must understand what you are truly fighting." The door swung open with surprising ease, revealing a circular room filled with artifacts that defied easy categorization. Swords that hummed with energy, armor that seemed to be made from crystallized starlight, and scrolls written in languages that had been old when human civilization was young. "The creatures you saw emerging are called the Shadowkin in the ancient texts. They ruled this world long before humans evolved. Their empire stretched across dimensions, and they consumed entire species for sustenance." Chen Wei selected a scroll from a golden case. "They were defeated not by strength alone, but by unity. Every intelligent species on Earth at that time joined together to fight them." Collins' team member with the tattoos, who had introduced himself as Sergeant Morrison, examined a helmet that seemed to be made from black metal that absorbed light. "What happened to the other species that helped fight them?" "Most were wiped out during the war. A few survived but went into hiding so deep that they became legends. Dragons, unicorns, beings that your modern world considers fantasy. They retreated to pocket dimensions to wait for the day when the ancient enemy would return." Director Collins felt her secure worldview crumbling. "Are you saying that mythological creatures are real?" "Reality is far stranger than your science admits. The creatures emerging from the mountain exist partially outside normal space-time. They can phase through solid matter, regenerate from seemingly fatal wounds, and manipulate the fundamental forces of nature. Conventional weapons are useless because they operate under physical laws that these beings can simply ignore." Chen Wei began removing weapons from their resting places, handling each one with reverence. A sword that seemed to be forged from compressed lightning, a bow whose arrows could pierce the veil between dimensions. Armor that provided protection not just from physical attacks, but from attempts to manipulate the wearer's mind and soul. The good news is that these weapons still function. The enchantments that created them were designed to last millennia. The bad news is that there are only a few dozen sets, nowhere near enough to equip an army. Through the monastery's communication system, urgent reports began streaming in. The creatures had reached the first populated areas, and the results were catastrophic. Entire city blocks had been reduced to twisted nightmares of alien geometry. Military units sent to engage the creatures had simply vanished, leaving behind only their empty uniforms and weapons. Morrison activated his radio. "Command, this is Recon Team 7. We need immediate updates on global breach status." The response came through clearly, though the voice on the other end carried barely controlled panic. "Sergeant, we have confirmed breaches in Tibet, New Mexico, the Amazon Basin, Siberia, and northern Canada. Additional sites are showing signs of imminent failure. Conventional forces are reporting zero effectiveness against hostile entities." Collins turned to Chen Wei with desperation in her eyes. "Is there any way to seal the breaches, force them back into their prisons?" The master consulted another scroll, his expression growing increasingly grim. "The original sealing required the combined power of thousands of warriors, many of whom sacrificed their lives to complete the process. We have perhaps a dozen people with the necessary knowledge, and most of them are scattered across the globe. Then how do we stop them? Chen Wei was quiet for a long moment, studying the ancient text. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. There is another way. The creatures have a hierarchy, like any army. If the primary commanders can be destroyed, the lesser creatures will become disorganized and vulnerable. But reaching the commanders requires penetrating to the heart of their dimensional stronghold. Where is that? Here, beneath this mountain. The breach you see on the surface is just the beginning. The true gateway to their realm lies far below, in chambers that predate human civilization by millions of years. The monastery shook as something massive passed overhead. Through the windows, they could see a creature that resembled a floating city, its underside covered in structures that pulsed with malevolent energy. Smaller creatures swarmed around it like insects, spreading out to establish forward positions across the valley. Chen Wei handed Collins a sword, whose blade seemed to be made from crystallized moonlight. This weapon can cut through dimensional barriers. It will allow you to harm creatures that exist partially outside our reality. But be warned, using it requires a clear mind and focused intent. Doubt or fear will cause it to become useless. Collins hefted the weapon, surprised by how perfectly balanced it felt. You're not coming with us? I have a different task. The monastery sits above a convergence point where multiple dimensional barriers meet. If I can reach the deepest chambers and activate the ancient defensive systems, I might be able to slow the creature's emergence, buy you time to reach the heart of their stronghold. Morrison examined a set of armor that seemed to be made from scales that shifted color like oil on water. How do we reach this stronghold? Chen Wei pointed to a section of the floor that was covered in intricate symbols. Beneath this chamber is a passage that leads directly into the creature's realm. It was created by the original warriors as an emergency route, a way to strike directly at the heart of enemy territory if the outer defenses failed. And you think 6 people can succeed where armies failed? 6 people armed with the proper weapons and knowledge have a chance. A large army would simply provide the creatures with more victims. Stealth and precision are your only advantages. The master began gathering supplies from various alcoves around the chamber. Vials filled with substances that glowed with inner light, talismans carved from materials that no longer existed on Earth, and scrolls containing incantations that could disrupt the creature's dimensional abilities. Each of these items serves a specific purpose, he explained as he distributed them among the team members. The liquid in these vials will protect you from the creature's mental attacks. They can drive humans insane with a single thought, but this substance will shield your minds. The talismans will prevent the creatures from tracking you by your life force. The scrolls contain words of power that can banish lesser creatures, but use them sparingly. Each one can only be activated once. Collins felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. What are the chances of success? Chen Wei's expression was unreadable. The ancient texts speak of prophecy. When the creatures return, humanity's fate will hang in the balance. Some interpretations suggest complete extinction. Others hint at a final victory that will end the threat forever. The outcome depends entirely on the actions of those who stand at the fulcrum point. And you believe we're at that fulcrum point? I believe that the next few hours will determine whether humanity has a future, or whether this planet will return to the dominion of creatures that view us as we view insects. The team finished equipping themselves with the ancient weapons and artifacts. Each member now carried gear that looked like it belonged in a fantasy novel. But Chen Wei's demonstrations had proven that every item was devastatingly effective against supernatural threats. Morrison tested the weight of a spear whose tip crackled with contained lightning. Master Chen, if we don't make it back, what happens to the knowledge you've shared with us? The monastery contains records of everything. If humanity survives, other guardians will emerge to continue the watch. If we fail, then it won't matter. The creatures will reshape this world according to their desires, and everything humans have built will become fuel for their expansion into other dimensions. A new tremor shook the building, accompanied by a sound like reality itself tearing. Through the chamber's skylight, they could see that the crack in the mountain had widened into a chasm that seemed to extend infinitely downward. Creatures continued to pour from its depths, but now they moved with purpose rather than random destruction. "They're organizing," Collins observed. "Setting up some kind of staging area." Chen Wei nodded grimly. The initial emergence was chaotic because they were disoriented from their long imprisonment. Now they're remembering who they are and what they're capable of. Soon they'll begin their systematic conquest. The master activated a hidden mechanism in the floor, causing the symbol-covered section to slide aside and reveal a stairway that descended into absolute darkness. The air that rose from the opening carried scents of ozone and something that smelled like burning copper. "This passage leads directly to the heart of their realm," Chen Wei explained. "The journey will take you through environments that human senses were never meant to experience. Trust in your weapons and in each other. Do not trust anything else you encounter." Collins looked at her team members, seeing her own mix of determination and fear reflected in their faces. They were soldiers, trained to face human enemies with conventional weapons. Now they were being asked to invade a realm of nightmare creatures with gear that looked like museum pieces. "Master Chen, one more question. If these creatures are so powerful, how were they defeated the first time?" The old warrior's expression softened slightly. "Sacrifice. The final victory required warriors to give up everything they were, everything they could have been, to power a binding that would last for millennia. They knew they were dying so that future generations could live free from this terror. And you think we might have to make the same choice? I think that heroes are defined not by their willingness to live for a cause, but by their willingness to die for it. The creatures you're about to face have had millions of years to perfect their hatred of humanity. They will not show mercy, and they will not hesitate to use every advantage they possess." Chen Wei handed Collins a final item, a small crystal that pulsed with warm light. "This is a communication device. It will work even across dimensional barriers. When you reach the heart of their stronghold, activate it. I will do everything in my power to support your mission from this end." The team began their descent into the darkness, their footsteps echoing strangely in the narrow passage. Behind them, Chen Wei sealed the entrance and began his own preparations for what might be the last battle of his life. As they descended deeper into the earth, the passage walls began to change from carved stone to something that looked organic, as if they were traveling through the digestive system of some immense creature. The air grew thick and difficult to breathe, filled with spores that made their enhanced weapons glow more brightly. Morrison activated a small device that projected a map of their route. "According to the Master's instructions, we should reach the dimensional barrier in approximately 2 hours. Collins felt her stomach churning, though whether from the strange atmosphere or simple fear, she couldn't tell. "Remember, once we cross that barrier, we're in their territory. Everything around us will be hostile. Stay together, watch each other's backs, and don't trust anything that looks familiar." Behind them, in the monastery above, Master Chen Wei began the most difficult task of his life. The ancient defensive systems required a living operator, someone willing to serve as a conduit for energies that would slowly consume their life force. He had always known that his destiny would require this sacrifice. But now that the moment had arrived, he found himself thinking of all the students he would never train, all the knowledge he would never pass on. But there was no choice. Humanity's survival depended on giving these brave soldiers every possible advantage in their impossible mission. Chen Wei placed his hands on the control surfaces of a device that had waited 10,000 years for activation and began the process that would either save the world or ensure that its destruction was properly witnessed. The dimensional barrier felt like stepping through liquid lightning. Collins and her team emerged from the passage into a realm that challenged their sanity with its alien geometry. The sky, if it could be called that, writhed with colors that had no names in human language. Structures that resembled massive coral formations stretched toward impossible horizons, their surfaces crawling with movement that suggested they were more alive than built. "Stay close," Collins whispered, though the words seemed to echo strangely in the twisted atmosphere. "Remember, everything here wants us dead." The team moved through a landscape that shifted and changed around them. What appeared to be solid ground would suddenly become liquid, forcing them to leap across gaps that hadn't existed moments before. The ancient weapons they carried provided the only stability in this chaos. Wherever the enchanted blades pointed, reality seemed to firm up enough to provide secure footing. Morrison consulted his map device, but the readings made no sense. "Ma'am, according to this, we're simultaneously at ground level and 3 miles underground. The dimensional distortion is interfering with our navigation." "Then we navigate by instinct," Collins replied. She held up the crystal Chen Wei had given her, watching as its light pulsed in different directions. "The master said this would guide us to the heart of their stronghold. Follow the brightest pulse." The crystal's light led them through a forest of structures that resembled enormous bones. As they passed between these formations, they began to hear sounds that suggested they weren't alone in this nightmare realm. Clicking noises that came from no identifiable source, whispers in languages that predated human speech, and underneath it all, a rhythmic thumping like a massive heartbeat. "Contact!" hissed Sergeant Morrison, raising his enchanted spear. 3 creatures emerged from the shadow of a bone structure, their forms shifting between solid matter and something that looked like animated smoke. They moved with predatory grace, circling the team while making sounds that were part hiss, part laughter. Collins drew her moonlight blade, feeling it grow warm in her hand as it detected the supernatural threat. "Remember your training. These things can phase through normal matter, but our weapons can reach them anywhere." The first creature lunged at the team's youngest member, a specialist named Torres, who carried a bow that fired arrows of crystallized starlight. The creature passed through his conventional body armor like it was mist, but when Torres struck back with his enchanted dagger, the blade bit deep into otherworldly flesh. The creature shrieked and dissolved into rapidly dissipating smoke. The other 2 creatures attacked simultaneously, moving faster than human eyes could follow. Collins met one with her sword, the moonlight blade leaving trails of silver fire as it cut through the air. The creature tried to phase through her attack, but the enchanted metal followed it into whatever dimension it retreated to, severing part of its essence. Morrison's spear crackled with contained lightning as he thrust it toward the 3rd creature. The being tried to dodge, but the electrical charge jumped from the spear tip and enveloped it in a cage of energy. The creature thrashed wildly for a few seconds before collapsing into a pile of ash that was quickly scattered by the alien wind. "2 down, only several million to go," muttered Torres, checking his equipment for damage. They continued deeper into the hostile realm, following the crystal's guidance through increasingly bizarre landscapes. They passed lakes of liquid that reflected different scenes. Some showed Earth as it currently existed. Others revealed possible futures where humanity had been enslaved or extinct. The sight of familiar cities reduced to feeding grounds for massive creatures made even the hardened soldiers feel sick. The crystal's pulsing grew stronger as they approached what appeared to be a city-sized structure that defied architectural logic. Towers spiraled in directions that shouldn't have been possible, connected by bridges that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The entire structure pulsed with the same rhythm they'd been hearing since entering this realm. "That's it," Collins said, pointing toward the structure's base, the heart of their stronghold. Getting closer proved more difficult than expected. The approaches to the structure were guarded by creatures that made their earlier opponents look like house pets. Beings the size of buildings patrolled the perimeter, their multiple eyes scanning constantly for intruders. Flying creatures with wingspans measured in football fields circled overhead, occasionally diving down to investigate disturbances on the ground. "We need a distraction," Morrison observed. "Something to draw their attention while we infiltrate the structure." Collins activated the communication crystal, feeling it warm in her hand as it connected with Chen Wei back on Earth. The Master's voice came through clearly despite the dimensional barrier between them. "Director Collins, I can see your position through the ancient viewing systems. You're close to the primary nexus, but the guardians around it are some of the most dangerous creatures in their hierarchy. Can you create a distraction from your end?" Collins asked. "I can activate the defensive systems, but it will alert every creature in both realms to my location. I'll be able to hold them for perhaps 30 minutes before the systems drain my life force completely." Collins felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders. Asking Chen Wei to sacrifice himself was essentially signing his death warrant, but without a distraction, her team would never reach their target. "Master Chen, there has to be another way." "There is no other way, Director. This is what I trained my entire life to do. When I activate the defenses, you'll have your window. Don't waste it." Before Collins could protest further, the crystal went silent. On Earth, in the depths of his mountain monastery, Chen Wei placed his hands on controls that had waited millennia for activation. Energy coursed through his body as ancient systems came online, drawing power directly from his life force to fuel weapons designed by a civilization that understood the true nature of reality. The effect was immediate and devastating. Across both realms, creatures that had been moving toward their objectives suddenly turned toward the monastery. The defensive systems projected fields that were actively harmful to beings from other dimensions, causing them pain that transcended physical sensation. In the alien realm, the massive guardians around the central structure began moving away from their posts, drawn by some irresistible compulsion to deal with the source of their agony. Flying creatures abandoned their patrol patterns and streamed toward dimensional gates that led back to Earth. "Now!" Collins ordered, leading her team in a sprint toward the structure's base. They covered the distance quickly, using the chaos of the creature's exodus to avoid detection. The structure's entrance was a massive archway that seemed to be carved from solidified darkness. Symbols around its border pulsed with energy that made their weapons resonate in response. Inside, the structure was even more disorienting than the landscape outside. Corridors led in directions that geometry insisted were impossible. Gravity seemed to be optional, with walkways that clung to walls and ceilings. The team found themselves climbing, crawling, and occasionally falling upward as they followed the crystal's guidance toward the structure's center. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew thick with psychic pressure that would have driven ordinary humans insane within minutes. Only the protective talismans Chen Wei had given them kept their minds intact as they pressed forward. They encountered more creatures inside the structure, but these were different from the guardians outside. These beings appeared to be administrators or technicians of some kind, focused on tending to systems that hummed with interdimensional energy. Most ignored the intruders, apparently considering them too insignificant to warrant attention. The crystal's light reached its maximum intensity as they approached a chamber at the structure's heart. The walls here were transparent, revealing the void between dimensions. In the center of the chamber stood a platform surrounded by control surfaces that looked like they'd been grown rather than built. And operating those controls was a creature that embodied every human nightmare about the unknown. The entity was roughly humanoid in shape, but scaled up to massive proportions. Its skin appeared to be made from the same material as the void between stars, and its eyes held intelligence that had been ancient when the Earth was young. This was clearly one of the primary commanders that Chen Wei had spoken of, a being whose destruction would cripple the invasion. The creature sensed their approach and turned to face them, its expression showing amusement rather than concern. When it spoke, its voice bypassed their ears entirely and resonated directly in their minds. Insects. Do you truly believe your primitive weapons can harm one such as I? I have devoured galaxies and reshaped the laws of physics to suit my whims. Your species exists only because we allowed it, and now that permission is revoked. Collins raised her moonlight blade, feeling it grow warm as it prepared to cut through dimensional barriers. Maybe we can't harm you permanently, but we can definitely ruin your day. The battle that followed tested the limits of human courage and ingenuity. The creature could manipulate reality itself, causing the chamber floor to become quicksand one moment and molten metal the next. It could attack from multiple dimensions simultaneously, forcing the team to defend against assaults that came from directions that didn't exist. But the ancient weapons proved their worth. Morrison's lightning spear could disrupt the creature's dimensional manipulations, temporarily forcing it to exist in normal space where it could be harmed. Torres's starlight arrows could track their target across dimensional boundaries, following the creature even when it tried to phase out of reality. Collins coordinated the attack, using her sword to create openings that her teammates could exploit. The moonlight blade could cut through the creature's defenses, leaving wounds that glowed with silver fire and refused to heal through normal regeneration. The battle raged across multiple dimensions, with the chamber around them shifting between different possible realities. At one point, they were fighting on a platform suspended over an active volcano. Moments later, they were standing in the vacuum of space, protected only by their enchanted equipment. The creature was testing them, trying to find an environment where their weapons would be useless. But human adaptability proved superior to ancient arrogance. Each time their environment changed, the team adjusted their tactics. When gravity reversed, they used it to their advantage. When the air became poison, they held their breath and fought faster. When reality itself began to unravel, they anchored themselves to their weapons and trusted in the magic that protected them. The turning point came when Collins realized that the creature wasn't just controlling the battle environment. It was drawing power from the void outside the chamber. If she could sever that connection, it would be forced to rely on its own internal reserves. Morrison, Torres, keep it busy. I'm going for the power source. Collins sprinted toward the transparent wall, raising her moonlight blade as she ran. The creature realized her intention and tried to stop her, but Morrison's lightning spear kept it pinned down with electrical attacks that disrupted its dimensional abilities. The moonlight blade struck the chamber wall with a sound like reality tearing. The transparent material cracked and then shattered, causing the void outside to rush in with a roar like the end of worlds. But instead of destroying them, the influx of raw dimensional energy was channeled by Collins' sword, turned into a weapon that struck the creature at its core. The entity's scream shattered what remained of the chamber's walls and echoed across multiple dimensions. Its form began to dissolve as the severed connection to its power source left it vulnerable. Ancient flesh that had survived the death of stars crumbled into dust that was swept away by interdimensional winds. As the creature died, the entire structure around them began to collapse. The control systems it had been operating sparked and failed, sending feedback through the network that connected every creature in the invasion force. Back on Earth, Chen Wei felt the change immediately. The psychic pressure that had been building since the breaches opened suddenly lessened. Through the monastery's viewing systems, he could see creatures across the globe stumbling and falling as their command structure collapsed. Without their primary coordinators, the invasion force was reduced to individual predators rather than an organized army. "Collins," he whispered into the communication crystal, hoping she could still hear him. "You did it. The network is collapsing. The creatures are becoming disorganized." But there was no response. The team was trapped in a collapsing structure in a hostile dimension with no clear way home. Collins looked around at her teammates, seeing the same realization in their eyes. They had accomplished their mission, but survival was no longer guaranteed. The structure around them was crumbling into the void, taking them with it. "Ma'am," Morrison said quietly, "it's been an honor serving with you." Torres nodded agreement. "At least we saved our species. That has to count for something." But Collins wasn't ready to give up. She held up the communication crystal, now glowing with residual energy from the creature they'd just destroyed. Chen Wei said this could work across dimensional barriers. "Maybe it can do more than just communicate." She focused all her will on the crystal, pouring her desperate need to return home into its crystalline structure. The device began to pulse with increasing intensity, resonating with energies that had been released by the creature's death. A portal opened in front of them, showing a glimpse of the monastery's hidden chamber. But the passage was unstable, flickering in and out of existence as the dimensional barriers reasserted themselves. "Go!" Collins shouted, pushing Torres toward the portal. "One at a time! Quickly!" Torres dove through just as the portal flickered. Morrison followed, his bulky frame barely making it through before the passage collapsed and reformed. The remaining team members went next, until only Collins remained. The portal was failing, its edges beginning to fray as the dimensional energies that powered it dissipated. Collins took a final look around at the collapsing nightmare realm, then threw herself through the closing passage. She landed hard on the monastery's stone floor, her ancient armor absorbing most of the impact. Around her, her team members were picking themselves up and checking for injuries. They had made it back to Earth, bloodied but alive. Chen Wei was slumped over the control surfaces of the defensive systems, his hair now completely white and his face aged by decades, but his eyes were alert and filled with satisfaction. "The invasion has been broken," he said weakly. "The creatures are retreating to their individual territories. Without their command structure, they'll eventually be hunted down and destroyed by conventional forces armed with the proper weapons." Collins knelt beside the old master, seeing how much the activation of the ancient systems had cost him. "Master Chen, you need medical attention." He waved away her concern. "I have done what my family was meant to do. The knowledge has been preserved and proven effective. Other guardians will emerge to continue the watch." Through the monastery's windows, they could see that the crack in the mountain was slowly closing. The creature's retreat had destabilized the dimensional breach, causing it to seal itself. Similar reports were coming in from around the world as other sites began to stabilize. Humanity had faced extinction and survived, not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through courage, sacrifice, and the wisdom preserved by those who remembered ancient truths. The creatures would eventually return, but not for many generations. And when they did, humanity would be ready. Chen Wei smiled as he watched Collins and her team prepare to leave the monastery. They carried with them the knowledge of how to create more enchanted weapons, how to train warriors in techniques that could combat supernatural threats, and most importantly, the understanding that humanity's greatest strength lay not in its technology, but in its willingness to stand together against impossible odds. The war was over, but the watch would continue. And somewhere in the void between dimensions, ancient intelligences took note of the species that had dared to challenge them twice and emerged victorious both times. Humanity had proven itself worthy of respect, even from beings that considered themselves gods. The age of hiding was over, Humanity now knew it was not alone in the universe, and it was ready to face whatever came next with weapons both ancient and new, guided by the wisdom of masters like Chen Wei and the courage of soldiers like Collins and her team. The future would bring new challenges, but for now, the Earth was safe, and humanity could continue its journey toward a destiny that even the ancient creatures had learned to respect.